The official communication arrived via registered mail, a thick envelope sealed with a solicitor's crest. Marcus, accustomed to the quiet solitude of his study, where the only sounds were the rustle of turning pages and the occasional hiss of the radiator, regarded it with a detached curiosity. His life was a meticulously curated existence of historical research, ancient texts, and the comforting predictability of academic pursuit. Unforeseen variables were an unwelcome disruption. The contents of the letter were terse, formal, and profoundly unsettling. A distant relative, a great aunt he had never met, had passed. Her estate, Blackwood Manor, was now his. The property, the solicitor informed him, was extensive, ancient, and situated in a particularly remote region of the Northern Territories. A map, crudely drawn but surprisingly detailed, depicted a winding track leading to a sprawling, isolated structure surrounded by dense, skeletal woodlands. Marcus felt no grief, only a faint intellectual intrigue. He had always been an observer, more comfortable dissecting the past than engaging with the present. The notion of inheriting the grand, decaying edifice held a certain gothic romanticism, a tangible piece of history he could, for once, physically inhabit. He dismissed the accompanying cautionary notes from the solicitor regarding the manor's reputation as provincial folklore, the inevitable embellishments of isolated communities starved for drama. His analytical mind, honed by years of sifting fact from myth, saw only opportunity for a new research project, a vast archive to explore. He resolved to treat it as merely another artifact, albeit one he would now own. The journey north was a study in diminishing returns. Paved roads gave way to cracked asphalt, then to gravel, and finally to a muddy track barely wider than his vehicle. The landscape became increasingly stark, the rolling hills replaced by a flat, desolate expanse of gray earth and leafless trees. The sky, a uniform slate, pressed down with an oppressive weight. He passed no other cars for hours. The signal on his phone vanished somewhere past a cluster of derelict farmhouses, leaving him in a pocket of absolute silence, broken only by the hum of his engine. A sudden, sharp glint caught his eye through a break in the trees. To his left, stretching for what seemed like miles, lay a vast, flat expanse of ice, the frozen lake. Its surface, a dull, opaque gray, reflected the heavy sky like a shattered mirror. A thin, almost imperceptible mist clung to its edges, giving it the appearance of an ancient, forgotten eyes staring blankly into the distance. The sight was arresting in its bleakness, a monumental stillness that deepened the sense of isolation. The wrought iron gates, rusted and overgrown with ivy, appeared abruptly. They were monumental, depicting intertwined thorny branches and stylized, faceless figures. A heavy chain, thick with corrosion, secured them. Marcus exited his vehicle, the gravel crunching loudly under his boots in the profound quiet. The air was frigid, carrying the faint, metallic scent of damp earth and something else, something indefinable like old dust and cold stone. He wrestled with the chain, his gloved fingers stiff, eventually prying open the ancient lock with a grunt of effort. The driveway was a serpentine path swallowed by encroaching weeds and skeletal branches, leading deeper into a tunnel of gnarled oaks. The manor itself emerged gradually, a hulking silhouette against the bruised sky. Blackwood Manor. Turrets rose like broken teeth against the horizon, and gables jutted out at odd angles, giving the structure a predatory, hunched appearance. He parked on the overgrown cobblestones of the forecourt. The wind, a low, mournful sigh, stirred the dead leaves in the corners of the manor's formidable facade. Marcus stepped out, his breath pluming in the hazy air. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees at the immediate vicinity of the house. He observed the structure with a historian's objective eye, noting the weathered gargoyles that leered from cornices, their stone faces eroded into grotesque parodies of emotion. The sheer age of the place was palpable, a heavy weight that seemed to press down on the very air. It turned in the massive oak front door with a groan that resonated through the entire edifice, a sound like a long-held breath finally expelled. It was a smell that seemed to cling to the back of his throat, a taste of profound antiquity. Marcus flicked on his powerful torch. The beam cut through the palpable gloom, illuminating a grand dust-shrouded space. Cobwebs hung like tattered shrouds from the high ceilings, and furniture, draped in white sheets, stood like an assembly of silent, spectral figures. He felt a faint tremor ripple through the floorboard beneath his feet, or perhaps it was merely the lingering vibration of the door closing behind him. He dismissed it as settling. His skepticism remained intact, but a subtle shift had occurred. The intellectual intrigue had been joined by a nascent, unacknowledged disquiet, and he was not entirely certain who had acquired whom. He shivered, a purely physiological response, he told himself, to the lack of heating. But the shiver lingered, a small, persistent tremor beneath his skin. Marcus approached the Manor's imposing entrance with the pragmatic resolve of a scholar facing a challenging text. The solicitor's communication had outlined his inheritance with stark, legal precision, leaving no room for sentimental interpretation. His primary interest lay not in the property's grandeur, but in its potential as an archive. The vast, echoing rooms, while unsettling in their silence, promised ample space for his extensive collection of historical documents, maps, and obscure tomes. He was a historian, a meticulous collector of facts, and superstition held no sway in his ordered world. The initial days were a blur of activity, a systematic invasion of the Manor's quiet decay. The livery trucks, contracted from the nearest town, rumbled up the long, gravel driveway, disgorging crate after crate of Marcus's life's work. He directed the movers with curt, precise instructions, designating the sprawling library on the ground floor as his primary research hub. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight that filtered through the grime-streaked leaded windows, illuminating the intricate patterns of cobwebs that laced the high ceilings. The air hung heavy with the scent of aged wood, damp plaster, and something else, a faint, indefinable mustiness that clung to the velvet draperies and tapestries. He spent hours unpacking, meticulously arranging his books by period and subject, his maps by region, his documents by provenance. The physical act of organizing brought a familiar sense of control, a bulwark against the inherent strangeness of his new surroundings. He worked late into the evenings, the beam of his desk lamp cutting a solitary swath through the pervasive gloom. It began subtly. One evening, as he reached for a particular volume on medieval land tenure, a distinct chill descended, localized and sharp, prickling the hairs on his forearms. It was not the general coolness of an old, unheated house. This was a pocket of frigid air, as if a freezer door had been momentarily opened beside him. He paused, his hand hovering over the spine of the book. He frowned, attributing it to a localized draft from a poorly sealed window or a faulty vent. He continued his work, dismissing the sensation. It was indistinct, a fleeting sibilance that dissolved before he could properly register it. Nothing. The only sound was the soft scratching of his pen against paper and the occasional groan of the old house settling. He rationalized it as the wind whistling through a loose pane, or perhaps the rustle of a mouse in the wainscoting. His skepticism was a well-honed blade, cutting through any hint of the inexplicable. The misplaced objects became a recurring, if minor, annoyance. He would place a specific manuscript on the corner of his large oak desk, only to find it minutes later on a nearby side table, or tucked beneath a stack of unrelated pamphlets. His reading glasses, habitually placed beside his open notebook, would sometimes materialize on the mantelpiece. Marcus, a man of precise habits, initially attributed these occurrences to fatigue or the disorienting effect of his new, sprawling workspace. He simply corrected the anomalies, retrieving the items with a sigh and a mental note to be more mindful. One afternoon, seeking a specific architectural drawing of the Manor's original layout, he delved into a rarely used study adjacent to the library. The room was smaller, lined with shelves of antique globes and dusty astronomical instruments. Behind a large, ornately carved cabinet, he noticed a section of the wall paneling that seemed slightly askew. Curious, he pressed against it, and with a soft click, a narrow, concealed compartment swung inward. Inside, nestled amongst layers of ancient, brittle linen, he found a collection of small, leather-bound journals and a bundle of faded letters tied with a silk ribbon. The first journal, its cover embossed with a faded family crest, belonged to a previous owner, a woman named Alina, dating back to the late 18th century. Her script was elegant but increasingly erratic. Then a shift. The stillness of the frozen lake outside my window seems to mock the turmoil within these walls. Marcus, find myself forgetting simple things. Where Marcus placed my embroidery. The names of servants Marcus have known for years. My husband, bless his soul, dismisses it as woman's frailty, but the house feels different. Marcus paused, a flicker of something beyond academic interest stirring within him. He skimmed further. My memories, they are not my own. Fragments of other lives, other voices, whisper at the edges of my thoughts. The master of the house, he says Marcus am unwell. Perhaps. The house drinks. It drinks the clarity, the truth. He moved to another journal, this one from a century later, penned by a man named Alistair. His handwriting was bolder, but similarly deteriorated over the entries. The solitude is a double-edged sword. It affords me ample time for my studies, yet it sharpens the edges of every perception. The house breathes. Marcus heard it at night, a low, resonant sigh from its very foundations. Objects shift, not merely misplaced, but moved. A book Marcus was reading found on a different floor. A portrait turned to face the wall. My own mind, Marcus' fear, is becoming as unsettled as the house itself. Historical curiosities, nothing more. A testament to the psychological pressures of isolation, perhaps, or inherited predispositions to mental decline, exacerbated by the harsh realities of life in a remote estate. He was a historian, accustomed to interpreting subjective accounts through a lens of objective analysis. He acknowledged the unsettling nature of the entries, the recurrent themes of memory loss and perceptual distortion, but firmly compartmentalized them as anecdotal evidence of past human frailty, not supernatural influence. He placed the journals on his desk, intending to transcribe relevant passages later. As he turned back to the study, a faint, almost imperceptible scratching sound emanated from behind the reclosed secret panel. It was too soft to be a rodent, too rhythmic to be the house settling. It sounded, for a fleeting moment, like tiny fingernails scraping against old wood, insistent and deliberate. Marcus stopped, listening intently. The sound ceased. He waited, motionless. It was just the house, an old house. Marcus stacked the last of the weather journals, their pages brittle beneath his fingertips. His initial assessment remained firm. Historical curiosities, nothing more. The accounts of spectral figures and disembodied whales were products of isolation, perhaps, amplified anxieties in minds already predisposed to fragility, or merely the embellished folklore of a remote community. He, a historian, dealt in facts, in documented causality, not in phantoms. He prided himself on his analytical detachment. It started small, almost imperceptibly, a faint creak from the floorboards above him, though he knew the upper levels were uninhabited. A whisper of air brushing past his ear when no window was open, no draft present. He attributed these to the settling of an ancient structure, the eccentricities of old wood and stone. The house was, after all, a monument to decay. His research continued, his study filled with the scent of aged paper and dust motes dancing in the shafts of weak winter light. He immersed himself in the meticulously kept archives, cross-referencing names and dates, tracing the lineage of ownership. The manor's history was a tapestry woven with threads of tragedy. There was the first builder, a land baron, who, after a decade of residence, simply vanished, leaving behind a frantic, incoherent diary entry about the walls listening. Then a succession of families, each tenure marked by an unsettling pattern. The family of merchants in the late 17th century, where the patriarch, driven to melancholia, was found drowned in the frozen lake behind the property. Repetitive scribbles before he was discovered, starred in his study, having apparently walled himself in. And later, the industrialist, whose wife, a vibrant woman by all early accounts, began conversing with empty rooms, her sanity eroding until she threw herself from a third-story window. Marcus felt a prickle of unease, a sensation he quickly dismissed as the natural empathy of a historian for his subjects. The sheer consistency of the narrative, however, gnawed at the edges of his skepticism. Not every resident, certainly, but a significant number had met ends that defied simple explanation. Beyond the general hardships of the era, each story concluded with a descent into madness or a sudden, violent cessation of life, invariably attributed by local records to melancholy or unspecified fever, followed by the estate being left abandoned for years before another hopeful owner arrived. One afternoon, as he meticulously catalogued a box of correspondence, a distinct sound reached him. Not a creak, not a rustle of paper, but a low, guttural murmur originating from the wall beside his desk. It was indistinct, like a conversation held just beyond a closed door, impossible to decipher, yet undeniably present. He paused, his pen hovering above a ledger. He frowned, attributing it to a trick of his own hearing, perhaps a minor auditory hallucination brought on by prolonged concentration. He rubbed his temples, a faint ache beginning to throb behind his eyes. He spun, his gaze sweeping the room, finding only the static forms of antique furniture and the heavy drapes. He rationalized it as an optical illusion, a consequence of the fading light in his own strained vision. He had been working long hours. That night, sleep offered no refuge. Marcus was plunged into a vivid nightmare. He was not himself, but a different man, his hands gnarled and trembling, clutching a quill. The room was the same, yet different, coated in a pervasive, cloying dampness. The words were not English, not any language he knew, yet he understood their intent. Insidious, hungry. He sat upright in bed, heart thudding against his ribs. The moonlight, stark and unforgiving, painted the room in monochrome. He forced himself to take slow, deliberate breaths. It was a dream, merely a dream, a byproduct of his intense research into the manor's disturbing past. The mind, he reminded himself, often processes its anxieties through such nocturnal dramas. It was becoming an active participant. Marcus, surrounded by the stacked journals, felt a familiar resolve firming in his chest. The accounts within them, filled with frantic scrawls detailing phantoms and weeping apparitions, were fascinating historical documents, certainly. Yet, his historian's mind filtered them through the lens of psychological distress, perhaps even mass hysteria, rather than supernatural phenomena. The cold, logical mechanisms of the past, he reasoned, could always be traced back to human fallibility, to the mind's desperate attempts to rationalize the inexplicable. He closed the final journal, its leather cover cracked and dry. Nothing here suggested anything beyond the projections of troubled inhabitants. A faint, metallic clang echoed from the floor below, sharp and abrupt. Marcus paused, listening. The house, ancient and sprawling, often produced such noises: the groan of settling timbers, the whisper of drafts through ill-fitting windows, the click of a heating pipe expanding. He dismissed it as one of the manor's myriad structural complaints and turned his attention back to his notes, summarizing the common threads of sightings and feelings described across the centuries. Minutes later, a distinct, acrid scent registered in his nasal passages, faint but persistent. He pushed back his chair, the legs scraping on the polished floorboards, and stood. The scent seemed strongest near the study door. He opened it, stepping into the dimly lit hallway. He noted the temperature drop, a measurable phenomenon, likely a draft from a distant, unsealed window. Yet, the scent intensified, now layered with something metallic, almost like old blood. Not there. The house was silent again, save for the rhythmic creak of timbers settling. It was not a physical touch, but a distinct mental weight, a profound sense of scrutiny. He told himself it was the lingering effect of the journals, the power of suggestion working on a tired mind. But the conviction felt less solid than before. He returned to the study, the feeling of being watched clinging to him like a shroud. He tried to focus on his work, but his attention fractured. The words on the page blurred. He found himself staring at the intricate patterns of the wallpaper, the faded floral motifs seeming to writhe and distort at the periphery of his vision. He blinked, rubbing his eyes. Fatigue, he concluded. Nothing more. Then, a flicker, a brief, incandescent flash in the corner of the room, like a faulty electrical current, except there was no electrical source nearby. Her mouth opened in a silent scream before the image vanished, leaving only the dim light of the overhead lamp. Marcus froze, his breath catching in his throat. He shook his head sharply, forcing himself to rationalize. A reflection. His mind, playing games. He stood, walked to the corner, examined the wall, the antique cabinet. The surface was undisturbed. He pressed his palm against the cool, solid wood. The unseen presence solidified, pressing in on him, no longer just a gaze but a palpable weight in the air. He stumbled backwards, knocking over his chair. The sobbing ceased. The scent dissipated. The pressure eased, leaving him breathless and trembling. Absurd, he muttered, his voice hoarse, attempting to reclaim his composure. A hallucination. Stress. But the house was not done. The walls around him seemed to ripple, the wallpaper's patterns twisting into grotesque, fleeting visages. Then, the room dissolved. He was no longer in his study. He stood on a narrow, snow-covered path. The biting wind lashed at his face, carrying with it the metallic tang of ice. He was an observer, a ghost within a memory. A figure emerged from the swirling snow, a young woman, her dress thin and inadequate for the brutal weather. She ran, stumbling, her bare feet leaving crimson marks on the pristine snow. She looked back, her eyes wide with a plea for mercy that would never come. Marcus wanted to shout, to intervene, but he was voiceless, immobile. The scene shattered like brittle ice, fragments of image and sounds swirling around him before coalescing back into the familiar, if now deeply unsettling, confines of his study. This was no trick of the light, no product of an overactive imagination. He had been there. He had seen it. The house was not merely old or isolated. It was a repository of suffering, a living archive of trauma replaying its agonies for him. And in that terrifying realization, he knew the unseen presence was not merely watching. It was absorbing. It was drawing him in, making him part of its endless, agonizing memory. Marcus pushed himself to his feet, his hands shaking. He was no longer merely observing the house's history. He was becoming entangled within it. The manor was not just haunted, it was hungry. His skepticism, once a formidable fortress, now felt like a crumbling ruin. He had been there. He had seen it. The house was not merely old or isolated. It was a repository of suffering, a living archive of trauma replaying its horrors. He needed to leave. The initial surge of determination propelled him towards the main entrance. The heavy oak door, which had seemed merely imposing before, now radiated a subtle chill, a resistance that was more psychological than physical. He twisted the cold brass knob. It turned, but the door remained stubbornly shut, as if swollen by damp or age. He pushed, then pulled, grunting with effort. The wood groaned, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the floorboards, but the door stayed sealed. Frustration gnawed at him. He tried the secondary exit, a smaller door leading to the overgrown gardens. The result was identical. Locked, but not truly locked. Simply unyielding. He retreated, his mind racing. The car he would drive. The vehicle sat on the gravel drive, coated in a fine layer of frost. The engine turned over, a weak cough, then died. He tried again and again. The battery seemed utterly drained, despite the car having been fully functional just days prior. This was too much of a coincidence. The landline, he remembered, was connected, though he hadn't used it. The dial tone was a flat, unyielding hum. He pressed the receiver to his ear, listening intently. Not even static. He tried his mobile phone. No signal. A dead zone. He walked from room to room, holding the device aloft like a divining rod. But the screen remained stubbornly blank, a constant no-service notification mocking him. The feeling of isolation deepened, settling over him like a suffocating blanket. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle. He would wake, his body heavy, his mind clouded. The manor seemed to breathe around him, its ancient timbers creaking, the wind sighing through ill-fitting windows, creating a constant, low thrum. It was the comfort of inevitability, of being utterly enveloped. A peculiar sense of belonging began to take root, an insidious tendril curling around his will. The idea of leaving, of rejoining the outside world, felt increasingly distant, irrelevant. What would he even say? How could he explain the spectral figures, the shifting memories, the profound, palpable sentience of the structure? They would dismiss him. They would pity him. He started neglecting himself. His beard grew unruly. His clothes became stained and crumpled. Meals were sporadic, often forgotten until a gnawing hunger reminded him, and then consisted of whatever stale provisions he could find. He rarely bathed. The thought of the cold water, the effort, too much to bear. One afternoon, a pale, anemic light filtered through the grimy panes of a drawing room window. He stood there, unmoving for what felt like hours, staring out. Beyond the skeletal trees of the manor grounds lay the frozen lake. Its surface was an expanse of dull, milky white stretching towards a distant, hazy tree line. It looked utterly still, utterly silent, a vast, unblemished sheet of ice holding untold depths beneath. As he watched, a faint ripple, almost imperceptible, seemed to pulse across its surface like a slow breath. He blinked, rubbing his tired eyes. It was gone. Just a flat, immutable white. He wandered through the empty rooms, drawn by an invisible current. He picked up an old leather-bound ledger from a dust-covered desk in a forgotten antechamber. It wasn't a historical document, but a personal diary penned in a delicate, spidery hand. The script was faded, the ink bleeding into the yellowed paper. It belonged to an anonymous resident from the late 19th century. He flipped through the pages, a growing sense of disquiet settling over him. The entries began innocuously enough, detailing daily life, weather, social calls. But as he progressed, the tone shifted. My will diminishes with each passing day. The outside world fades, a forgotten dream. Marcus's breath hitched. The words mirrored his own experience with unnerving precision. It has taken more than my youth. It has taken my essence. Marcus see its hunger in my own eyes. He stumbled into the study, driven by an urgent, morbid curiosity. He found a tarnished silver mirror on a side table, its surface clouded with age spots and dust. With a trembling hand, he wiped away a patch of grime. His reflection stared back. The face was undeniably his, but it was thinner, the skin beneath his eyes bruised with fatigue. His usually sharp gaze was dull, unfocused. His hair, once meticulously kept, was lank and greasy, but it was the eyes that held him captive. He saw the house's hunger not in its walls, but in the emptiness reflected in his own gaze. The house wasn't just influencing him, it was consuming him slowly, methodically, from the inside out. The eyes sunken, rimmed with a purple bruise that hadn't been there moments ago. A stranger's face, yet undeniably his own. Marcus blinked, a slow, deliberate action as if to reset the visual data. The reflection remained, gaunt and unfamiliar, a hollowed-out version of himself. A tremor ran through his hand, the silver mirror clinking softly against the side table. He did not recognize the man staring back. Not truly. A wave of disorienting vertigo swept over him, the study seeming to tilt on its axis. He braced himself against the heavy oak desk, its cool, smooth surface anchoring him, if only for a moment. How long had he been in this house? Wiggis! The concept of linear time had begun to fray at the edges, dissolving into a nebulous stretch of moments. He remembered arriving, the initial skepticism, the careful historical research, but beyond that, the details blurred, coalescing into a single, overwhelming sensation of quiet dread. He pushed away from the desk, his legs feeling strangely unsteady, as if they belonged to someone else. He needed air, a clear view, something to confirm the reality of his surroundings. He turned toward the door, the familiar entryway to the main hall, but the door was gone. This was not possible. He had entered this room mere minutes ago. He ran a hand over the smooth, unblemished wood. No seam, no latch, no handle. It was as if the entrance had simply never existed. Panic, sharp and sudden, clawed at his throat. There, tucked between two leather-bound volumes, a small, polished wooden box caught his eye. His fingers, guided by an unseen compulsion, reached for it. The wood felt impossibly old, worn smooth by countless touches. As he lifted the lid, a faint scent of dried lavender and old parchment wafted into the air. A memory, sharp and vivid, pierced through the fog of his confusion. Not his memory. For safekeeping, a voice whispered in his mind, soft and melancholic. Until he returns. Marcus recoiled, dropping the box onto the desk with a dull thud. He had no memory of this moment, yet the sorrow, the profound sense of loss, resonated deep within him, as if it were his own. Was he Marcus, the historian, or Elias, the grieving man from the fragmented vision? The distinction was becoming perilously thin. Driven by a desperate need to escape the shifting confines of the study, he searched frantically for another way out. He pulled at a heavy tapestry, revealing not a window, but another section of identical paneling. He pushed against a hidden spring in the mantelpiece, hoping for a secret passage, but found only solid brick. The room, once a familiar sanctuary, had become a cage. Then, at the far end of the study, where a wall of bookshelves had always stood, a new opening appeared. Not a door, but a wide, arched entryway, leading into a dimly lit corridor he had never seen before. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, Marcus stepped through. The corridor stretched impossibly long, the floorboards groaning underfoot with each step. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced individuals he did not recognize, their eyes seeming to follow his progress. The temperature dropped steadily, his breath beginning to plume in the frigid air. Finally, the corridor terminated in a massive, frosted glass door. He pushed it open, a gust of icy wind immediately biting at his exposed skin. Below, stretching to the horizon under a leaden sky, lay a perfectly flat, unnervingly still expanse of white. A frozen lake. Its surface, a mosaic of fractured ice, reflected the bleak sky with an almost metallic sheen. He shivered, a deep, bone-rattling tremor. He had no memory of this lake, no recollection of the manor possessing such a feature. The house had simply arranged itself around him, presenting him with a reality entirely alien. He looked back, expecting to see the corridor, the study, the familiar interior of the manor. Instead, the frosted glass door now opened onto a sheer, unbroken wall of gray stone, indistinguishable from the exterior of a forgotten fortress. The door, the corridor, the study, all were gone. His mind reeled, grasping for purchase, for any anchor of his former self. Marcus, the historian. He remembered dusty archives, forgotten text, the satisfaction of uncovering a forgotten truth. But these memories felt distant, like fragments of a dream. He looked down at his hands, thin and pale, the nails slightly discolored. Were these his hands? Was this his life? The tremor that began in Marcus's hand spread through his arm, a fine vibration that resonated deep within his bones. His reflection in the polished wood of the wardrobe door remained, a stranger's face superimposed upon his own. The sunken eyes, the bruised purple beneath them, the sharp angles of bone where flesh had once been. He pressed his palm against the smooth surface, the wood cool and unyielding. The image did not ripple. It simply was a clinical assessment. This was not a trick of light. His vision was unimpaired, yet the man staring back was not the one he knew. A sudden, cold certainty pierced through the initial shock. He had seen this gauntness before in the faded daguerreotypes scattered throughout the manor's archives. The last residents, their faces drawn, eyes vacant, before their ultimate disappearance or demise. His gaze swept the room, searching for an anomaly, a source. The antique furnishings stood sentinel, unmoving. The velvet drapes hung limp, yet the stillness felt charged, expectant. Marcus walked toward the study, his footsteps unnaturally loud on the polished floors. The details eluded him. He could visualize the ledger, its brittle pages, the spidery script, but the content, the crucial historical data, had become indistinct, a blurred smear of information. He found this unsettling. His memory, historically precise and tenacious, was failing him. He sat at the large oak desk, pulling forward a stack of papers detailing the manor's succession. He focused, concentrating on dates, names, events. As he read, a name surfaced, not from the page, but from a sudden, intrusive thought. Eleanor Vance. Marcus had no recollection of encountering this name in his research. He checked his notes, his meticulously organized files. No Eleanor Vance. The detail felt alien, yet undeniably present in his mind, a foreign insertion. A low thrum vibrated through the floorboards, a subtle resonance that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the house. It was a sound without a source, a deep, pervasive hum that settled in his bones. He pulled on his heavy coat, the wool ruff against his skin. The manor's main door, usually stiff, swung open with an unnerving ease, revealing a landscape bleached to color. He found himself walking toward the rear of the property, drawn by an unseen force toward the vast, unbroken expanse of the frozen lake. The surface was a sheet of dull, opaque ice, stretching to the distant tree line. As he stood at the edge, a faint shimmer appeared on the ice directly beneath his gaze. It was not a reflection of the sky, nor of the surrounding trees. He leaned closer, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The shapes coalesced, momentarily forming vague, ephemeral outlines. A human silhouette, then a hand reaching upwards, then a face, gaunt and terrified, its features indistinct, yet universally pleading. It was the residue, the lingering essence of those who had come before. Not merely ghosts, not mere echoes, something far more fundamental. They were the same as his reflection. The manor was not merely haunted, it was a hungry thing. He saw it with a terrifying clarity. The house was a living, consuming entity, its roots embedded deep within this land, drawing sustenance from the very life force of its inhabitants. It fed on memories, on sanity, on the vitality of those who dwelled within its walls. The vague historical accounts, the disappearances, the gradual decline of each owner. It wasn't misfortune or madness. It was digestion. The memories he'd lost, the foreign ones implanted, the physical changes in his appearance. These were all symptoms of consumption. The frozen lake, too, was part of it, a reservoir for the echoes, a mirror to the manor's insatiable hunger. He was not a guest, not an investigator. He was the current meal. The realization, stark and unyielding, settled in his mind with the weight of a coffin lid. The house had chosen him, and it was slowly, meticulously, devouring him whole. The tremor in Marcus's hand had not subsided. It was a faint, internal hum now, a vibration that resonated with the house itself, as if his very bones had become tuning forks for its malevolent song. The face in the polished wardrobe door, a stranger's gaunt visage overlaid upon his own, still stared back, eyes sunken and bruised with a color that mimicked old fruit. He recognized the sharp angles of the jaw, the prominent cheekbones, but the essence felt foreign, a mask he was forced to wear. The house was not merely blurring the lines, it was meticulously erasing them, scarifying his identity layer by layer. It was a precise, almost clinical recall of his past self, before the house had begun its relentless consumption. The clarity was brief, a pinprick of light in the deepening fog, but it was enough. A spark ignited, cold and desperate, in the hollowed space where his determination used to reside. He would not surrender. Not yet. He spun from the wardrobe, the movement jerky, unpracticed. He ignored it. He had to find something, anything, that the house had tried to hide. It had consumed memories, distorted reality, but it was a physical entity. It must have a physical weakness, a point of origin, a method of undoing. His search began in the study, the room where the first whispers had coalesced into coherent dread. He ran his hands along the spines of books, not seeking titles, but discrepancies. The texture of aged leather, the coarse grain of linen, the smooth glide of polished oak. His fingers sought a loose panel, a false bottom, a concealed catch. The dust motes danced in the shafts of light that pierced the grimy windows, each particle a silent witness to his frantic, methodical movements. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of decaying paper and something else. A metallic tang, like old blood, or perhaps just the ozone preceding a storm. Nothing. Then to the heavy oak desk, running his hands beneath the drawers along the intricate curvings. A faint vibration hummed through the wood, growing more pronounced as his fingers traced a particular pattern, a series of interlocking knots that seemed out of place. His thumb brushed a minute imperfection, a raised burr in the otherwise smooth surface. He pressed. A small, narrow compartment, no wider than his palm, sprang open from the side of the desk. He pulled it out, his fingers trembling, not from the house's influence, but from a surge of desperate hope. The leather felt rough, almost alive, beneath his touch. The journal contained meticulous, spidery script, faded with time. He had understood, he had seen the house for what it was. Her entries detailed the consumption, the blurring, the insidious erosion of self. But then, a series of frantic, almost illegible pages, he had discovered the truth. The house drew its primary sustenance from the sorrow and fear embedded in the land itself, a primal, elemental wellspring. And there was a counter-ritual. It involved the frozen lake. The journal spoke of a specific artifact, a small, polished stone, described as the heart of winter, which must be immersed in the lake at the deepest point of its freeze, under the light of the waning moon. The stone, according to the journal, acted as a siphon, drawing the house's concentrated malevolence into itself, then releasing it back into the elemental indifference of the ice, effectively neutralizing its primary source of power. It was a dangerous act. The woman had warned, for the house would resist with every fiber of its being. The ritual required a sacrifice of memory, a deliberate severing of a chosen, cherished recollection to empower the stone. The metallic tang in the air intensified, stinging his nostrils. But the clarity held. The image of his unblemished hand, the sting of the phantom cut, anchored him. This was it. A slim, terrifying chance. He clenched the journal, the rough hide digging into his palm, a tangible anchor against the rising tide of the house's rage. The frozen lake awaited. Then, the reflection rippled, not like water, but like strained fabric. The stranger's features elongated, distorted, then dissolved, leaving Marcus's own reflection, pale and drawn, staring back from the polished wood. A distant thud echoed through the silent manor, a sound heavy and final, like a tomb ceiling shut. Marcus spun, his gaze sweeping the ornate bedroom. Nothing had visibly changed. Yet the air felt colder, thicker, as if the house had just taken a deep, suffocating breath. He moved towards the door, his steps tentative. The floorboards groaned in protest, a sound that no longer seemed merely structural. As his hand reached for the brass knob, a sharp violet crack ripped through the air directly above him. A section of the ceiling plaster, previously unblemished, fractured and spiderwebbed, a fine powder dusting his hair. It was not collapse, it was a warning. He pulled his hand back, his heart now a frantic drum against his ribs. The house was not merely reacting, it was responding. He tried another door, one leading to a rarely used servant stairwell. It was always unlocked. Now, the knob refused to turn, rigid and unyielding. A low, guttural growl seemed to vibrate from the wood itself, not a sound heard with the ears, but felt in the chest. He backed away, his gaze darting. The grand hallway, usually a straight shot to the main staircase, seemed to subtly warp. The shadows deepened, not from lack of light, but from an active, encroaching presence. A familiar portrait on the wall, that of a stern-faced matriarch, shifted its gaze to follow him, its painted eyes holding an accusation. Marcus moved faster, his determination hardening into a desperate resolve. But the house had other plans. As he approached the turn in the corridor that led to the west wing, a shimmering, translucent wall of what looked like solidified glue materialized, blocking his path entirely. They spoke in a language he almost understood, a language of sorrow and despair, punctuated by sharp, high-pitched wails. A spectral figure, tall and gaunt, its features indistinct, coalesced within the gloom. It lifted a hand, a gesture of malevolent command, and Marcus felt an invisible force slam into his chest, knocking the air from his lungs. He stumbled back, colliding with the wall, the impact jarring his teeth. The figure advanced, its form wavering like heat haze, and the air around it crackled with an icy static. He pressed himself against the cold stone, his breath ragged. This was not a haunting. This was an active engagement. The house was trying to break him, to corner him, to consume him. He pushed off the wall, turning to flee in the opposite direction, towards the conservatory, hoping for a window, an exit. But the corridor had changed. The familiar arches had elongated, the very perspective shifting, making the end appear impossibly distant, shrouded in a swirling, gray mist. The polished floor beneath his boots gave way to rough, uneven ground, and the elegant walls of the manor dissolved into a sparse, skeletal forest of leafless trees. A bitter wind whipped at his face, carrying with it the faint, metallic tang of decay. He looked down, and saw not the familiar Persian rug, but a vast expanse of dull, opaque ice stretching out before him. He was no longer in the manor. He was standing on the edge of the frozen lake. The lake. The stories of the lake. A memory, not his own, but one the house had forced upon him, surged forward. He saw figures, indistinct and sorrowful, huddled at the water's edge, their faces etched with despair. The sound of cracking ice, impossibly loud and resonant, echoed across the desolate landscape. He felt the woman's unbearable grief, a crushing weight that threatened to buckle his knees. The house was forcing him to witness, to feel, the very moment of a life's final desperate surrender. It fed on the raw emotion, the ultimate despair. This was its currency. This was the absorption. Marcus fought against the invading sorrow, against the icy grip of the lake's despair. He was not this woman. This was not his memory. He clamped his eyes shut, shaking his head violently, trying to dislodge the intrusive vision. This was a narrative it was imposing, a story it wanted him to inhabit. If he could understand the structure of this torment, perhaps he could find its weakness. He was not broken. Not yet. He had to find a way back to the real house, to his own reality, before the lake claimed him too. He turned from it, the image clinging to his peripheral vision, a persistent smear on his awareness. The time for hesitation had evaporated. This what? He moved with a grim resolve, the old floorboards creaking beneath his weight, each groan a protest from the house. He descended, not to the familiar cellars, but to a deeper, forgotten stratum he had uncovered through weeks of obsessive study and the accidental shifting of a dislodged stone in a hidden passage. His breath plumed in the frigid air, each exhalation a cloud of white against the encroaching gloom. The passage narrowed, the rough-hewn stone walls pressing in, slick with condensation. Water dripped somewhere ahead, a hollow, rhythmic sound that seemed to pulse with an unnatural heartbeat. He felt the house's resistance now, not as physical barriers, but as a subtle distortion of space, a faint vertigo that threatened to disorient him. He gripped the lantern tighter, his knuckles white. He had spent too long piecing together the fragmented history, connecting the lines of sorrow and madness that converged on this very spot. Finally, the passage opened into a vast, subterranean cavern. The cavern floor was not solid earth, but a colossal expanse of ice, a frozen lake, perfectly still, reflecting the meager light of his lantern with an eerie, obsidian sheen. Tendrils, thick and gnarled like ancient roots, emerged from the walls of the cavern, snaking down towards the ice. His plan, meticulously researched and desperately conceived, felt fragile in the face of this raw, ancient power. He had brought with him a small, heavy iron box, unearthed from the manor's oldest archives, said to contain an object of immense symbolic weight to the manor's original builders, a relic he believed was the true nexus, the anchor of the house's sentience. He needed to reach the edge of the ice to place the box upon it, and perform the count ritual he had painstakingly deciphered from archaic texts. As he took a step onto a precarious descent towards the lake, the house retaliated, not with a tremor, but with a direct assault on his mind. They were faint, translucent, but their anguish was immediate and piercing. A man, slumped against an invisible wall, his face a mask of despair. These were the others, the forgotten, the consumed. Their silent screams echoed in his skull, a chorus of fading identities. Then, the reflections in the ice shifted. His own face stared back, but it was not entirely his. The gaunt visage from the wardrobe door was clearer now, overlaid with his features, a translucent mask of another's suffering merging with his own. Another memory to be absorbed, another life to fuel the roots. He stumbled, his foot slipping on the slick rock. The iron box clanged against the stone, the sound echoing unnaturally in the vast space. He fought for purchase, his mind reeling. He was Marcus. These were real, tangible. These were his. The tendrils pulsed more visibly here, a slow, viscous rhythm. He could almost hear the house breathing. With trembling hands, he opened the embarks. As he knelt, poised to place the figurine on the ice, the mental assault intensified. His own memories began to fray at the edges, images of his past blurring, identities shifting. He saw himself as a child, then as a young scholar, but the faces of his parents, his colleagues, were indistinct, their features melting like wax. The house was trying to erase him, to make him forget who Marcus was, so that he could be absorbed seamlessly into its vast living tapestry of despair. But a flicker of defiant rage ignited within him. Not now. This was his last stand. He clawed at the icy ground, his fingers numb, the raw cold biting through the thin fabric of his gloves. The iron box, a leaden weight, pressed into the slick stone beneath his palm. He was Marcus. The name felt like a fragile barrier against the surging tide of forgotten faces, whispered names, and phantom sensations that were not his own. He clung to it, a lifeline in a swirling vortex of encroaching pasts. His breath plumed white, ragged and shallow. He hauled himself upright, the wind of physical force against him, whipping at his threadbare coat. Before him stretched the vast, unforgiving expanse of the frozen lake, its surface a black mirror reflecting the bruised, starless sky. The ice groaned beneath his weight, a deep, guttural complaint that made the hair on his arms prickle. He felt watched, not by eyes, but by the very fabric of the world around him, a silent, all-encompassing awareness that pulsed with malevolence. Its sharp edge, honed by time or design, seemed to hum faintly against his skin. He remembered the cryptic texts, the frantic scribblings of previous inhabitants, the recurring symbol of a severed root, always associated with this place, this frozen lake. It was a place of severance, of endings, of profound stillness. He took a shuffling step onto the ice, then another. He could feel its tendrils reaching, probing at the edges of his mind, attempting to unravel the threads of his identity. Images flickered. A woman weeping in a forgotten parlor, a scholar hunched over crumbling parchments, a child's laughter echoing in empty corridors. He had a purpose. Here, the ice was thicker, a solid, immutable mass. The manor's presence intensified, pressing down on him, a crushing weight of centuries of absorbed lives. "Yeah then, rest, join us." He ignored them, his gaze fixed on the box. He fumbled with the clasp, his frozen fingers clumsy. The metal protested, groaning like a miniature version of the lake itself. With a final, desperate grunt, it sprang open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded, brittle velvet, lay a single object, a shard of obsidian, impossibly black, carved into the shape of a jagged tooth. This was it. The key, the weapon, the final desperate gamble. The frozen lake itself seemed to stir. Deep cracks spiderwebbed across the surface, emanating from beneath him, accompanied by a sound like tearing fabric, impossibly vast. The manor's image shimmered, distorting, its walls appearing to ripple and breathe. The house knew it was fighting back, its full, terrible power unleashed. Spectral figures, translucent and indistinct, began to coalesce on the distant shore, their forms wavering like smoke. They were the absorbed, the lost, their eyes empty, their mouths open in silent pleas or condemnations. He saw faces he almost recognized, faces from the manor's portraits, faces from his own fading memories. Don't, it's useless. You're already one of us. Marcus gripped the obsidian shard. Its warmth spread through his hand, a strange, invigorating current. He felt a surge of defiant clarity, a fierce resolve burning through the encroaching fog. This was his last stand. He was Marcus, and he would not be another memory, another echo in those endless halls. He raised the obsidian shard high above his head, its sharp point glinting even in the dim light. The manor howled, a sound that ripped through the air, tearing at the fabric of reality. The eyes beneath him bucked violently, threatening to throw him down. But Marcus held firm, his teeth gritted, his eyes fixed on the black, gleaming stone. With a primal shout, he plunged the obsidian shard downwards, aiming for the deepest, most resonant point of the ice, where the tremors seemed to originate. The shard met the frozen lake with a piercing crack, not of ice, but of something far more ancient, far more resistant. A wave of pure, concentrated agony ripped through him, not his own, but the house's. A scream of unimaginable pain that echoed across the vast, still landscape. The ice fractured not just locally, but across the entire frozen lake, long, jagged fissures radiating outwards like a broken mirror. A guttural shriek tore through the air, a sound so profound and alien that it threatened to shatter his very sanity. The spectral figures on shore dissolved into wisps of smoke. The manor's silhouette wavered, contorted, and for a terrifying moment, seemed to sag, as if wounded. The wind died. The hum ceased. The ice, though fractured, held. Marcus stood, the obsidian shard still clutched in his hand, its warmth now a searing burn. His own past felt distant, a story told by someone else, about someone else. He looked down at his hands, thin and pale, and felt a profound disconnect. It was wounded, yes, but not destroyed. He could still feel its presence, a faint, lingering pulse like a massive, injured beast. He looked across the frozen lake at the fractured, reflecting surface. His reflection stared back, but it was not entirely his own. He had inflicted a wound, perhaps a devastating one, but the cost had been immense. He was Marcus. Yes, but a Marcus irrevocably altered, a vessel that had been emptied and refilled with an essence that was neither entirely his own nor entirely the house's. He had escaped absorption, perhaps, but he was no longer whole. He was something new, something terrible, entwined forever with the essence of the manor, a silent sentinel on the edge of the world.